What makes a serial killer? Is it one's love for a hearty, frosted breakfast and an ability to put it down? That's right. I'm on to you, Tony. No, it's not. It is, however, when a person kills 3 or more people. There have been tons of serial killers in the world, let alone the United States. So with all these monsters walking around, it makes you wonder, who are the 6 most brutal serial killers?
Henry Lee Lucas was an American-born serial killer, born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia. Over the span of 20 years, he was found responsible for over 350 murders. However, according to his confessions, he's actually responsible for over 600. Mr. Lucas eventually spent 10 years in prison after he took the life of his own mother. However, unfortunately, due to overcrowding in that prison, he was eventually released and became a drifter, eventually making friends with a gentleman by the name of Otis Toole. The record came to show that with the help of his accomplice, Otis, Mr. Lucas eventually went on to commit another 108 murders. He eventually died in prison on March 12, 2001, due to natural causes at the age of 64. Edmund Kemper, also known as the Co-Ed Killer, was an American-born serial killer born on December 18, 1948. Between May of 1972 and February of 1973, Kemper began picking up female hitchhikers, taking them to isolated areas, and then killing them. He would stab, shoot, or even smother the victims, and afterwards take their bodies back home and commit necrophilia, followed by dissecting them. He was responsible for the death of 6 college girls. Much like other serial killers, he did have something that would set him off. See, for Edmund, what would cause him to search for his victims was getting into an argument with his mother. In an odd situation, after pulling a gun on a woman and abducting her, he locked himself outside of his car, leaving the woman inside with the gun. Unfortunately, her judgment was skewed as she decided to let him back into the car. Shortly after this, Kemper killed her. Kemper's final killings were those of his mother and her best friend. Following that tragic event, he went on a long cross-country trip in a rented car loaded with guns and ammunition. This was eventually ceased with a decision to surrender. Even though he wished to be sentenced to death, he ultimately received life in prison. Theodore Ted Bundy was an American-born serial killer born on November 24, 1946. In Burlington, Vermont, Bundy murdered numerous young women across the United States between 1974 and 1978, and he even managed to escape prison twice before his final apprehension in February 1978. After years of continuous denial, much like my high school years. Get it? Denial? You get it, you know what I'm saying? Because when I was younger, I got denied. Yeah. I am also sad. Just kidding. Anyway, he eventually confessed to 30 murders. The total number of victims to this day still remains a mystery. Typically, Bundy would bludgeon his victims and then eventually strangle them to death. This was then followed by the acts of rape or necrophilia in order to lure in his victims. He would pretend to be a policeman or fake an injury, and once they finally approached him, it was then he would strike them with a crowbar. He was sentenced to death by the electric chair, a sentence that was carried out on January 24th, 1989 at 7 a.m. Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender, born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the year of 1960. Dahmer's killing spree lasted more than 13 years. His targeted victims were mainly African-American gay men at bars, malls, and even bus stops. Dahmer would use the promise of sex and drugs to lure in his victims into his small, urban apartment. Once there, Dahmer would engage in various sickening crimes, including killing, dismembering, and even sometimes eating parts of his victim. Dahmer would freeze his victims' body parts in order to preserve them as a trophy. Drums of acid, along with other instruments of horror, were removed from his apartment days after his arrest. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work with two other convicted murderers, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. After they had been left alone to work on their tasks, guards walked in seeing that Scarver had brutally beaten both men with a metal bar from the prison weight room. I would say that's pretty impressive, considering I can barely do 2 reps without sounding like Gollum from Lord of the Rings.
Alright. The precious!
Dahmer was pronounced dead after approximately 1 hour, with Anderson also succumbing to his injuries days later. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. Gacy was a well-liked public figure for both him and his alternate persona, Pogo the Clown. Along with participating in magic shows for children, he also ran a string of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants, and due to his success and popularity, even considered running for mayor of his hometown. However, Gacy's sick fantasies slowly came to light. He was a sex-obsessed monster whose dark path was ignited by searching for wife-swapping and prostitution, along with sexual relationships with young men. As his hunger consumed him, Gacy eventually kidnapped and murdered more than 30 men and boys. Over the course of many years, he buried the bodies around and under his home, leaving a mountain of evidence for the police. Gacy was tried and convicted for 33 murders, leading to him being put to death via lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. Herman Webster Mugget, also known as H.H. Holmes, was not just an ordinary serial killer, but he was also America's first documented serial killer. H.H. Holmes? Come on. It sounds like a bad realtor. H.H. Holmes was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilbannon, New Hampshire. Growing up, Holmes had a very privileged childhood. He also showed signs of being unusually intelligent at such a young age. H.H. Holmes also had a really strong interest in medicine, which eventually led him to practicing surgery on animals. In 1886, Holmes moved to Chicago, Illinois, finding work at a pharmacy under his current alias, Dr. Henry H. Holmes. Over time, Holmes took over the pharmacy after the owner mysteriously disappeared. With his newfound ownership, he then constructed a 3-story building, which eventually became known as the Murder Castle. It was completed with his living quarters, rooms for guests, trapdoors, chutes. Some of the rooms even had gas jets, which were used to asphyxiate his victims. Eventually, Holmes was caught and charged with insurance fraud, which later transformed into the case of Benjamin Pitzel's murder. While in custody, Holmes admitted to killing 27 people. However, authorities still believe that he was responsible for more than 200 other murders. On May 7th, 1896, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, H.H. Holmes was hung for the murder of Pitzel.
When it comes to brutal serial killers, these guys took it to a whole nother level. And unfortunately, the list of serial killers keeps growing as time goes on. With that being said, we should be grateful that we made it through another day full of mayhem. Please feel free to like and subscribe so that you don't miss what's next. And if you'd like to see me in a different light, check out my brother channel, Fireball McCall. Whether you'd rather look hip or cool, or would just like to support me and the work that I put into this channel, feel free to check out my clothing line, www.outbreakunleashed.com. I'll put a link in the description below. Until next time, I'm McCall in this case. closed.